following session is titled Culture, Cultivation, and the Administrator's Role. Reverend Robert Paul serves as an associate pastor and headmaster of Memorial Lutheran Church and School in Houston, Texas. He is currently a candidate in the PhD program at Concordia Seminary, St. Louis. He serves on the Board of Regents of Luther Classical College and serves as CCLE Vice Chairman. Please welcome Reverend Paul.
First of all, there are way too many people in this room for this topic. So either you don't like any of the other ones, or you're weird because you want to know what administrators do, which is more than nothing. Secondly, we're not going to have a whole lot of time for question and answer, but we'll do a little, because that's really the point of Julia Habrecht's roundtable after this. So after we talk through culture, what it looks like, what it doesn't look like, what it can look like, how it's really ambiguous in some respects. We'll do a little bit of Q&A at the very end, but really save those for the roundtable with Julia, because that will make that more, right, you've thought about it for an hour, and now you talk about it. That's kind of the idea here. Secondly, how many of you are actually administrators? That's helpful. How many of you are here to spy to figure out what your administrator should be doing? Not enough of my own people raise their hands to that question, because there's a lot of them here. Thirdly, we're going to do a lot of abstract, because the point of the Q&A is more concrete. And we're going to end with concrete, because culture is subject to stereotype and generalization first. Everybody thinks they know what certain cultures are because they've either seen them in television or met one person from New York or whatever, and they say that's the culture. But the administrator has a unique role in culture, which is a bit of a burden, right? Since if people care about the administrator forms the culture, is a view to the culture, looks like the culture, at least should. And what they say and what they don't say, what they do and what they don't do, is one of the many influences that happens on a school's culture and subcultures. So first, let's start with definitions, and then we'll move into more abstraction. You could define culture as a set of norms, practices, and values that characterizes a group. These can be minority groups, they can be majority groups. You can talk about Jewish culture or New York culture. But even there, you've already stereotyped, because there are New Yorkers who are really Midwestern and hate the city, and there are people from the city who hate everybody else, especially if you're in their way. And there are people from Long Island who are happy to live far enough away from the city, but still enjoy the food, right? So there's a lot of stereotype. In classical Lutheran, we'll also end up having stereotype, depending on what people know about Lutherans and classical. And that's just one place that stereotypes can come from when it comes to a culture. If you want to be more philosophical, Joseph Pieper, with Leisure, the Basis of Culture, essentially defines culture as the natural goods of the world which belong to us but are beyond our immediate needs and wants. And this is helpful because most of the things that we consider cultural are not just food, water, and shelter, even though certain kinds of shelters and certain kinds of foods represent different cultures. Most of culture is beyond what you need to survive on a daily basis. Even though some of you might say we can't survive without music, some people do, right? Most people survive with clothes, but certain cultural dress, right, becomes more accidental to being a human. So culture is beyond just immediate needs and wants. It is a larger thing. Culture consists of habits and customs. It consists of music. It consists of rites of passage. It consists of worship. Culture and cultus, related words. Different kinds of worship exist in different cultures. Classical Lutheran culture has a certain kind of worship. It consists of food. Culture can consist of taboos, consist of dress, of worldview, of pilgrimages, and of hospitality or lack thereof, depending on which kind of culture you're from. There are lots of different things that are part of a culture. You could list more, but many of these things will manifest themselves in your school, manifest themselves in your home, manifest themselves in the greater society in which you live. Pick your town, your part of the country, your history. All of these things are part and parcel, not just of the school culture, but of all the multitude of cultures that converge in any one place. Who participates, then, in the culture of your school? Now, we could do this from a homeschool perspective, but you have very moderately limited, right? You could probably count. You might need your foot, depending on the size of your family, but the people who are inside your homeschool and participate in your homeschool are a little fewer than when you're dealing with a brick-and-mortar institution. But in the inner circle, the people who participate in the culture of the school are the administration, who could also just be the faculty, if you're in a small enough place. The students and the parents are in the inner circle. They're the people who are there every day, or at least you interact with every day, and they have the most say. Their cultures impact the school culture all the time, because they're the people that drop off, they're the people who are in your classroom, they're the people teaching, they're the people telling you what to do, so the inner circle. Outside of that, depending on your circumstance, would be your church or church association, the families of those students and parents. These could be siblings that don't go to your school, but their culture impacts and you're participating there. Maybe the grandparents who show up every once in a while. This is going to sound a little sterile, but donors, right, also participate. And these may be concentric circles. People who donate to your school are probably just the church members. But they interact with your school culture in a different way when they donate than when they come to church on Sunday and the kids are singing upstairs. And then you have alumni, who some schools focus on, others don't. Then there's how many people have left before they actually finish the program that you don't want to call alumni because they haven't earned that right. Nobody else thinks that's funny. Lots of people leave. I went to this school. Yeah, you did, but we don't count graduates as third graders. Right? So you got to finish to be an alumnus or an alumna. But those people do participate in the school culture. And then on the outer circle, you have the people who are prospects and who visit for any number of reasons. These are not hard and fast, but just people to think about that participate in your school's culture and the various cultures, subcultures that are represented in your school. Schools have all of the things that I said can make up a culture. Right? Schools have pilgrimages. They're called field trips. And some of them are cultural. You might remember, in this grade, you went to this place. Or at this time of year, you did that. Now, you can debate whether or not you should go on a field trip, but people do them anyway. So you might as well understand them as part of culture. There's taboos, in other words, things that get you sent to the principal's office, or things that don't belong here, that aren't a part of your culture at school. There are certain, and these are not just things that are illegal, right? There are legal things that, right? If we all start smoking, and your building is not against smoking, right? It's not really helpful for children to watch you smoke a pipe up front when you're walking around. At one time it was, and it's a sad day. But right, there are taboos that are cultural, as opposed to just not according to the rules. You have dress, right? Most schools have a code or uniform, right? And that is part of the culture of the school. More code maybe for faculty, or maybe your school wants to have a uniform. I wear a uniform all the time. It's part of the culture. But what forms these subcultures and cultures? First, you've got church. And church can mean a number of things. It can mean your local congregation, which is what most of us deal with. But it could also mean an association of congregations, where you have a lot of different players who have some forming and some molding to do with the culture of your school. It could also be district. Some districts, like Wyoming, right, it's a very unified culture there. Other districts, we don't even tell them what we're doing because that's not helpful to our culture. Other districts don't even know you're there until you send in your statistical report, if you do that. So they have a way of interacting with your culture. And so does synod. This depends on time, certainly. Sometimes you can talk about positive influence on culture. Sometimes you can talk about negative influence on culture. Sometimes you can talk about nebulous influence on culture. And that's all different times or same times in our history. So church forms and molds culture. Families. The families of the school form and mold the culture. Sometimes this is done in a way that you can't see, either because it happened before you, when you showed up there as a faculty member or an administrator or as a family. And it could have happened forever ago. Certain things belong to cultures that we either can't explain anymore or we know the story because everybody knows why we don't do this on Thursday. Right? There are very specific things that occur in culture. Right? You don't sit on that side of the room or you always sit on this side of the room or nobody takes that pew no matter how long the family stopped coming. Right? All sorts of ways in which culture is formed and shaped. You've got society, and society has generally in every age, a negative impact on a school in its culture, even if you thought at one point that it was fine. The negative could just be that it made you think that you were safe when you probably weren't. That'd be the most sort of benign negative, besides all the other ways that we can see media in all of its forms, social media, and local cultures having a say on what our school looks like or doesn't look like, or what your school has to say or not say within where they are. Right? And I'm not just talking about political correctness. I'm talking more about what belongs to the locality and what things you sort of have to figure out. Right? I'm from Long Island. I talk funny. I've lived there for less than half my life now, and I still talk funny because I keep living in different places. And that can affect people culturally. Mostly they just make fun of me, especially when I say orange. But the point is that there are cultural things that your society will do, like in Texas and in the South, where culture has a certain kind of politeness, that in New York would be very different. If you say yes, sir, in New York, you'd usually do it with like your eyes rolling, right? Whereas that's normal in other parts of the country to say yes, sir, and that sounds respectable, not in New York. You wonder why are you treating me like that? Or you really don't like what I told you to do, right? Especially yes, ma'am. That makes no sense, except in like. But in the South and in Texas, those are normal. And one of the things that's important about this presentation is that there are certain things that belong to cultures or don't belong to cultures that you need to figure out as a group, school, etc., that you want in your culture or don't want in your culture. And some of them are not going to be right or wrong. Others are. At the end of this presentation, we'll talk about the sine qua nons of culture, what belongs in a school, and what an administrator should work to make sure has to be in a school. But certain things aren't necessary. If you want to argue about their necessity, it'll take a while. You should save it for the round table. For example, bells. Some people may think that these are absolutely necessary to a school, and if you don't have them, that is something that tells you to stand up and leave, or something that you wait for. When is this guy going to be done? At least the bell's coming, right? Some places the bell works positively. Some places the bell works negatively. I would not include bells as a sine qua non, without which there is not. I would argue against them. One of the reasons why we don't have a memorial is because they're broken. And it was just easier to teach people that the teacher is in charge, and then the teachers have to argue you held the kids too late, right? And actually communicate. But you may think that you have to have them, and you may come up with a very good argument as to why, and you can defend it properly and use it in your culture, and that's great. But we have to be careful, this is the New Yorker, of judging other people's cultures before we understand exactly why they do what they do, and when they do what they do, and where it comes from. It may actually be wrong. But wait a second, maybe 10, before you jump and scream and hoot and holler about certain cultural things. Speaking of hooting and hollering, the government forms and molds your culture. It happens in multiple ways. Some states have more say over education in our Lutheran schools, and some states have less say. It was at the very end of Pastor Kane's presentation in here before. You should know what that say is and what that say isn't, because it can be very surprising where the lines actually are. I love Texas. The lines are really nice. New Mexico, the lines were really nice. Other states have different lines, and those lines may absolutely affect your culture. And you may not have a choice about it, even if you want to put a "Don't Tread on Me" flag in the front of your classroom. You might have to adapt culturally and use those things to your advantage in a way that's beneficial, as opposed to just saying you have no absolute say. Now again, before jumping down someone's throat, find out where the rules actually are. What's actually required by your state? In New Mexico, you really just had to make sure that you did fire drills. That's really it. And you didn't have to do anything else. But you should know. There's a website that I can't tell you the name of, but if you type in like state laws that affect private schools, you'll get a big long list of all the states and what they say and don't say. And, we could talk about passive and active resistance at some point. That tends to be something we like to do, right? But you should know what you're passively and actively resisting and how that affects your culture. Faculty and staff form and mold the school culture in many ways. This happens in time, right? Every day. It happens over decades, depending on how long your school's been there. Certain things are done a certain way because someone did them once, and that cultural way of doing things has stayed. Other times, you might have had someone do the damnatio memoriae, it's the damnation of memory, and remove any visage of that person from the school and in the culture so that you can't tell they were ever there. And sometimes you may be tempted to do that if it gets in the way of having the culture you'd like to have at your school. And lastly, something that forms and molds the school's culture is experience. These are individual experiences, these are corporate experiences, these are historical experiences. A personal experience of mine is that I was taught a really terrible version of Jesus Loves Me as a child, and therefore I don't like that song. Now, all of you are free to have your own opinions, but I was told to sing, "Jesus loves me when I'm bad, even though it makes him sad. Jesus loves me when I'm good, when I do the things I should. Therefore, I don't like Jesus Loves Me." All of you got to learn the Lutheran version, and I learned some crazy, legalistic Baptist version that is only shared by oral tradition. That's my own personal individual culture. I don't ban people from singing "Jesus Loves Me," as long as they don't sing that version. So there are individual experiences that shape and mold a culture. Some people don't like New Yorkers because of me. Some people don't like New Yorkers in spite of me. It may benefit your school's culture to not like something, like a New Yorker, or it may not. So the administrator and the whole group needs to figure out which individual experiences are part and forming of the culture, and which ones we just joke and laugh about. Corporate experience forms a culture. All the faculty may go to a conference, hear something really good or really bad, and therefore try to impact the local culture of the school. And then there are historical experiences. The reason why we do this is because 35 years ago, right, so-and-so disliked pizza, and therefore we've never had pizza at our school ever again. Right? There are historical things that mold your culture. So with what culture can be, again, very nebulous and broad in many respects, and how many people play a part in it, both in the participatory sense, people who are engaged in your daily life as a school, but all the different ways in which the school culture is formed and molded, what's the role of the administrator? The role of the administrator is multifaceted, but I think first and foremost, what the culture of the school is, or needs to be, or becomes, is that which the administrator, or the headmaster, the principal, the deans, the assistant principals, it's what they keep and what they guard. As long as your administrator stays a long time, which unfortunately in our circles they tend not to, we tend to take from each other a lot, or rotate. But if you can stay long enough, you can be and become the keeper of that culture. Even if you just invest that in the office, right? The office of the headmaster principal is the one who keeps and guards it. Ultimately, that's the person who's in charge of hiring, so that person does have some way of controlling faculty. Ultimately, that person does have say in terms of students. And it's a big burden, right? I'm the first person to say that I, as a headmaster, am not perfect at whatever I'm talking about, except when I talk about maybe New York things. But that's not true either. So there are many failings that I personally have with regards to what I'm going to talk about, and growth areas, because you can't talk about failings anymore, right? So I have a lot of growth areas, but I think in spite of my person, the office of headmaster is the keeper and the guardian of the school's culture. And that's a difficult thing to do because it requires that headmaster to be engaged with every single group of people that I talked about in order to do that. If you're keeping and guarding the culture, you have to be with the students, and you have to be with the parents, and you have to be with the church, and you have to be with the faculty. And there's only so many hours in a day, even when you get a moderate amount of sleep. There's only so much time. So part of culture is long game. Because most things that we view as cultural, and that still are cultural, have been there for a while. Like certain foods that match certain cultures. Now, they haven't been there forever, right? Because Italian culture before 1492 did not include tomatoes, right? Even though today, we would say that's a without which there is not, just as as a stereotype. From the outside, I'm not Italian. So some Italians may say, this has to be here to be Italian, generally speaking. And then they may say, no, this is Tuscan. We don't like the people from the South. Just as anybody can say of any group that they're a part of, we don't like the people from that town. We like the people from this town because they hold their sandwich the right way, whatever it is. So it's important to be the person who keeps and guards the culture. As the headmaster, as the principal, whatever title you want, you are the one who hands over, now these terms are irritating, but they're useful, the mission and vision of the school to all the constituents. Right? Mission and vision are helpful because people look for them sometimes if they're used to outside of us. Don't go beg people to write mission and vision statements. But you should know what the mission of your school is and where it's looking forward to. And that could be very simply just a couple of Bible passages, or it could be something that's a motto, or it could be something that is, was given to you by some business guru. As long as it actually matches what you stand for, you are handing over that every time you're talking to your faculty, at a conference, to the people who walk up to your door randomly, whether they're homeless in Houston, or like actually looking for school, or both. That's both a joke and not a joke. But people do look to the head to hand over, and they do it without even thinking about it. When you look at parents, what parents do or don't do, what they say and don't say, sets a tone when you look at a person's family. And you could be totally unjust in whatever assumption you just made about that family or this family based upon. But people still do make those judgments. And so the administrator has to be very careful that people are looking at what he's saying and not saying, what he's doing and not doing. And they may be making the wrong conclusions. Right? I'm not going to say it up here. Everybody knows the joke about the word assume. Right? But it still doesn't mean that people don't do it. and that the administrator doesn't have a role in helping people make the right assumptions. The administrator also inculcates habits. Part of being an administrator, unfortunately, is editing handbooks. Yeah, well, some people like that. I surround myself with people who like that. And I hold on to the handbook that somebody else slaved over, right? Keeper of the culture. You want to make sure that what you're saying in your handbook is the part of the culture that you want or don't want. And what you're not saying in your handbook is part of what you do or don't want in your culture. Because that will do something. There are habits in how we address people in the hallway, how we discipline, how we dress. I don't know what it's like to not have a shirt tucked in. Now, I don't tend to tuck in like funny things, right? Everybody knows there are shirts you're not supposed to tuck in, at least they're supposed to be, right? But I model tucked in shirts all the time. Nobody follows it, right? But I still model it. I wish I shined my shoes. You don't really get to shine sneakers, so. But that's just one thing I don't use my time for. The administrator also trains participants to live and represent the culture. This is faculty in service. That's a fancy way to do it. But it's also how you talk to parents, how you talk to students, and different kinds of students. Certain parts, I don't know if I'll say this enough times, certain parts of culture are for certain groups of people. Right? There are certain things that belong to culture that we don't. Right? We don't necessarily give children. We might wait till they're older. Certain rites of passage, certain things. Right? Certain cultures give wine to children at a young age. Other cultures can't because you'll get arrested. You could argue either way, depending upon your, right? How many people have taught the Lord's Supper and then had the law-abiding citizen raise their hand and say, you give communion to underage people, right? Because culturally, that's how they think. If I'm not 21, I can't have wine because I'm a Baptist and they give grape juice anyway. Right? If you have those people in your school. So there's a training that is done that the administrator is a part of, either because he made sure that we want to do this thing in our school, it's a part of our culture, and so we talk about it every year, or the administrator just does it anyway, and everybody's used to that being a part of the song and dance of the administrator. I already mentioned this, but one of the roles of the administrator is the modeling of the culture. Now, there's a lot of cultures. There's a faculty culture, subculture. There's a student subculture. There's a parent subculture. And an administrator may live in any number of those by virtue of his or her vocations. Right? I am both a parent and a faculty member and an administrator. And so certain things, now you don't want to be like split personality or duplicitous, where that headmaster's a real, right? When you're drinking with the parents. I'm talking to me, right? But you want to be the same person, but just as, right, adults are allowed to drink alcohol in certain cultures, or, right, in Italy or in France, things are done differently, so too should you be aware of the fact that you're representing different cultures and managing them. They're all part and parcel to the whole school culture. And if you don't want something to be in the whole school culture, you might want to try and eradicate it in a school subculture. Right? We host Scotch tastings as fundraisers at our school, but we don't give it out in kindergarten because I don't want to go to jail. Right? That's part of the culture for the parents and the faculty, and the kids can look at us having a good time responsibly and respectfully and see that that's something they'll inherit. Right? But this is important for lots of reasons. When you're going to make arguments against challenges to the culture, like say a phone, We don't let kindergartners drive. Maybe we shouldn't let other adults drive too, but that's a different story. But there are certain things that belong to certain stations in life and certain subcultures, and we shouldn't be afraid of saying, this belongs to me because I'm a pastor, teacher, right? And this doesn't belong to you, and I don't care if you think it's fair or not. You should be comfortable having that discussion and saying that, because you will get resistance from the wildest places, like parents putting phones in their kids' suitcases, most likely on a trip where the phones are banned. Because apparently a lot of people forgot that they had to use payphones or not contact someone in their life. Right? So there are cultural things that are important to pay attention to, even when you're talking to people who are your age or older. Right? I'm young enough to know about cell phones and have used them when I was younger than many people, but I'm old enough to still remember what it sounds like to dial 1-800-COLLECT. Because I didn't have any money and I had to be picked up. I'm also old enough to remember just to walk home, right? So there's, phones are something I would fight against, and we are fighting against them. But I still need to use this to effectively communicate in ways that children don't have to worry about. And that's not for them to determine. That's for adults to work on. So, exhibition of school culture. School culture and all of its subcultures is exhibited on a daily basis when someone walks into the building. They see the culture. And the headmaster, the administrator, the principal, does have a say over this. Now, I'm allergic to micromanagement, and I really don't like decorating. So you should find somebody who likes decorating and is a good part of your school culture to help with the front. But when people come in and everybody's happy and welcomes them, that's a part of your culture. When people don't talk, when they come into the front office and say, oh, you sit over there, that's a part of your school culture. And it could only be the subculture of the people up front because they had a miserable morning, but the first-time visitor has no idea that that person had a miserable morning. They might think that every single person in your school is like that. Now, the administrator shouldn't necessarily go and ream the person out, certainly not while the people are still in the room. But you might want to pay more attention to that, especially if you hear, right, from the grapevine, whichever grapevine you have. It could be coffee hour, or it could be, right, a family recommended a family. You know, I told them all these good things, but they didn't come because so-and-so in the front office was really rude. It could be that so-and-so in the front office just lost their mother, right? But there are lots of things that are a part of the keeping control of the culture, guard of the culture, is a better word, that administrators should be paying attention to. Events exhibit school culture. And again, these are mixed, because certain events are for students and their families, certain events are just for adults, certain events are just for faculty and staff. None of those events should be illicit or sinful, right? So this is not an argument for, right, binge drinking or, right, whatever. You could pick any kind of weird thing. It could be legal in your state to smoke pot, but I would not really advocate for adults, right? I mean, it could make faculty meetings easier. But mine are at 6 a.m. We just feed them real food. People still aren't thrilled, but pay attention to how the events shape or don't shape the culture. I like food and drink for other people, even when I'm not drinking. I drink coffee, but right, even when I'm not drinking or eating, it's a good part of the culture to hand over. Let's talk about challenges. There are lots of challenges. I'm going to focus on 4 because I think they're relatively universal. You could have your own challenges that you perceive or have actually dealt with. But the 4 I'm going to focus on are phones, social media, the regime, which is like everything that's going on outside of us, right? You could fit alphabet soup in there, any of those things, COVID restrictions, and parents. Because Now, I'm going to talk about parents as a strength at the end of this. But parents are also can be a challenge and may provide you with challenge. You could also include faculty and staff, but I like my faculty and staff, even if they, never mind. So, phones, technology. I went to seminary when people had laptops and the old guys still played Farmville in the back on their computers. That's an individual experience that has formed my culture. I don't think we should have anything like that in classrooms. Right? There's some head nodding. Apparently, some of you want to play Farmville. Right? But phones in the school and other electronic devices of that nature. Now, we can argue about when papers should be written by a computer as opposed to by hand. Our school's through 12th grade. But we actually haven't bought computers again since the Chromebooks are mostly dying because that's such a tricky thing to navigate, and you want to make sure that when you spend all that money, you did the right thing. But I'm willing to say that this is a challenge we have to speak about and make sure that people belong in that culture. We studied the book Glow Kids as a faculty 2 years ago, and surprisingly, we had a lot of parents really happy that we read it. And they also, even if before we talked about that book as a school, were like, my kid has a phone and he's in 4th grade. Afterwards, these same parents were like, we took it away. But there's so many terrible things that come from that. It does not need to belong to student culture. I wish there were better answers for adult culture. I'm not willing to tell you what to do. But I would say you should spend as little money as possible on the thing. I'll tell you that. Right? I'm super cheap. 3 gigs of data, I don't care. And when they try to sell me more, I said, no, I have the 3 gig plan. It's super cheap. We run out in 4 days because I have to communicate with people, but I don't care. 3 gigs. Now, Mr. iPhone over there is, I told you I would do something. The Pastor iPhone. The Reverend Mr. iPhone. I remember you showing me the first one I ever saw at seminary. But I think that's an important challenge that you have to talk about. Now, in your culture, you may have already done away with that. Or you might not have yet had to face it. Depends on what part of the country you're in, what kind of people you're dealing with. Although everybody, right? I was amazed on our honeymoon years ago that Belize, worn out mahogany buildings, third world country, everybody's got one of these. So, even that, everybody had one. Nice clothes and a phone, but right, different place. Social media, you could use all media as a challenge, but it keeps creeping in deeper and longer. And again, this is another thing that's a tool for adults. Now, you could argue against it, and you could say we don't do that, and if all your families are fine with that, then great. Right? Don't worry. You could also be using that tool for good, and then telling the kids you're not allowed to use this, you're a child. In the same way that you don't let them drive to school. Now, it'd be funny, but not very helpful if we had to have licenses to run social media. Don't do that. But social media provides a challenge in any number of ways because of what people are imbibing, right? They're opening their eyes and their soul is receiving all sorts of crazy stuff. Even, right, just very briefly, because they're scrolling. But that's a challenge to the parents and their culture, to your faculty and their culture, and certainly to students. The regime. Depending on where you live, you may have certain interactions with the regime that others don't. I love Texas. And Houston is really great, because I don't really have to battle a whole lot. And people come to us because we were much more liberal with regards to masks. I grew up on Long Island in New York. I'm really thankful that my children aren't that observant, Because there's a lot of bad stuff there that if I had to still be on Long Island, we'd be having a different presentation. However, my individual experience of growing up on Long Island was helpful when we had a parent support group, which I'll talk about at the end, where someone said, how do you handle the transgender thing with your kids? Because at this other classical school, my older son has a classmate whose family has that flag outside their house even though they go to this classical school. And now it's being talked about in my house. We talked about it carefully and cautiously because we love people. But even when you think, right, we're talking about a classical school run by some pretty conservative Roman Catholic types that are non-diocesan, that's still popping up there because everybody's being affected by it. It's a challenge. You may not have to deal with it except in sort of a fluke instance, depending on where you live, what kind of families, right? Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is all of us know each other by at least one person. It's just, I mean, I used to say two. It's not true. It's just one. I was in a KFUO interview with my brother-in-law. They didn't know that when they picked us. So, and many of you might know his father-in-law, right? One person. Parents. Most of us are used to stereotyping parents as a challenge. I'm going to talk more about parents as the one thing that I think I'm doing okay with right now. But parents often are a challenge to the culture of the school that administrators have to deal with. And this could be when, right, you're talking to parents who are in their 40s and 50s, and they still got their kid a phone when they were 9. You're like, what are you doing? This is not a shared experience. You didn't have a phone when you were 9. And if your parents were still alive, they'd probably make fun of you. I guess it's not funny. But the parents can be a challenge. There are lots of ways in which parents can be challenged, but when all of these challenges sort of compound upon themselves, the culture of the school and the subcultures contained therein are at stake. Now, let's talk about strengths and weaknesses. At Memorial, we have a couple of strengths that, at least I think they're strong. The first one is daily chapel with weekly divine service. And what's really unique about this is that more non-Lutherans come to the divine service and don't come up because we don't let them. Since we've had it, there's just 1 year of experience, but we have a lot of parents at divine service. That's a strength of our culture affecting the parents and their culture. And kids invite their parents to come to chapel, especially because thanks to Pastor Hill, we bless people on their baptism, birthdays, and little kids bring their grandparents and say, you have to come today because I'm, right? So that is a cultural strength. If you don't have daily chapel, you should bludgeon your administrator, that could be yourself, I guess, and figure it out. Because that, right, nobody's arguing against getting rid of lunch on Wednesday because they ate on Tuesday and will eat on Thursday. Okay. Pastor Keyser gave me this one, which is Coffee with the Headmaster. Probably they just come because they like kolaches. But every month, we do a Coffee with the Headmaster with kolaches and coffee and decaf for one particular New Yorker who's not me. And we have 20 to 40 parents and church people come and engage in the culture of the school. And it's very healthy. Now, your number could be different if you engage in this. It's not about numbers, but it is about intent and communicating the culture. Because what happened from this is that parents started asking when we studied Gibbs's little blog post on a classical school needs a classical home. The parents said, can we just sit and talk about that? So we did. And now we have a support group on the third Friday of the month called Classical Home, where we have a dozen different families who are church members, non-church members, some are non-Christian, but they care about the same things that are a part of our culture, and they're coming. Now, right, not all things are equal. We have some parents who fight against our culture at our school. We have other parents who are new to our culture who say, can you pay attention to what's happening in summer camp? It doesn't match what's going on from August to May. We're talking like 5 steps removed from the culture. Dyed-in-the-wool Roman Catholics, Italian. But they care because of what the culture, they understand the culture of the school to be. They also come to classical home. Weaknesses, consistency. Right? One of my things I need to do is spend more time with faculty because I prefer to heckle students and hang out with parents. So I'm going to be better about being with faculty. Your culture you may spend all your time with your faculty and the parents are totally neglected. You may spend all your time with the students and everybody's neglected, not just your own children. You should be able to identify your weakness, say it out loud. I have many, that's one of them, and then try to figure out how to fix it, because it's a long game. Culture is a long game. Lots of things are cultural that maybe once weren't, right? Tomatoes in Italy. They weren't part of Italian culture. Dante wouldn't want to eat pizza with you. Probably wouldn't, right? You'd say, you're a bad Italian. He'd say, you're a bad American. A normal American, criticizing other people. So you have to be careful and pay attention to that. Goal. It's essentially from my weakness, right? So I need to spend more time with faculty, personally, to work on school culture, and more time with students I don't teach, and more time with parents that don't show up at Coffee with the Headmaster and Classical Home. Now, everybody knows how much time they don't have. Right? Doesn't matter who you are. So pick your battle, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. Right? Certain things you wait to get rid of or add. Certain things you know you'll never have. Certain things you know you have to have. And you should be able to think about the long game of when those battles occur or don't. And let the real friends, the real constituents, help you judge when those battles need to be fought or not. Some battles have to be fought immediately. Right? If all of a sudden you've got girls kissing in the hallway, you can't, well, I guess I'll wait. Right? You can't. You can't be like, I'm going to wait. There's definitely wisdom in waiting on certain battles. 40 years in the wilderness was the waiting game. They didn't cross over to the promised land. Don't think about your faculty that way. It's not helpful. You can think about your students that way because they'll only be there for less than that anyway, unless they're just really bad students. So it's important as the administrator and as people who talk to the administrator and care about the administrator to help with these cultural things. Because the administrator, whether he wants or she wants to be or not want to be, does a lot with the culture and subcultures of the school. Now, we'll talk about the sine qua nons, right? Without which there is not. Daily chapel is a sine qua non. Now, if you have to call devotions, right, in order to get the couple of stodgy teachers who think you've taken away their time, I didn't do that. Pastor Mary said, do it right away. So we had chapel right away. Pastor iPhone didn't have to do that. I did that for him. You're welcome. But I think that's a sine qua non, because the actual culture, to go to Pieper, if you haven't read Joseph Pieper's Leisure, the Basis of Culture, he's a Roman Catholic. But if you just substitute divine service, or Mass as understood in the Augsburg Confession, he's right. That the worship of the triune God, right, actual worship, is the basis for everything that we're doing. And there's no easier way than to tell your pastor to show up on his day off, or get some schlub who doesn't get the day off during the week, to do Monday through Friday and have daily service. There are different ways to do it, and by different ways, I don't mean, right, Lutheran substance and somebody else's style, whoever they are. I mean, if you can show up for Vespers on Friday and close your week like that, that could be better if your schedule works that way. But don't give up the everyday gathering people around the stuff that actually works even when you're not. Everything else that we do doesn't have the same guarantee as the preaching of the Word of God, even if you wanted to. Right? I taught them that multiplication table. Doesn't matter. But the preaching, gathering your whole community around the Word and Sacrament, thankfully doesn't rely on you, no matter who you are, which is very helpful. So, sine qua non. It's also not magic, so you need to teach people. Right? So catechesis needs to be in your culture. You need to be catechizing everybody all the time. This goes for the administrator, but it also goes for all the teachers. Just because you don't teach religion doesn't mean you're catechizing or not catechizing. There is a metaphorical way in which everybody's being catechized by you, especially if so-and-so doesn't come to chapel or so-and-so says, well, go ask that person. I'm not a pastor. Luther is pretty clear that everybody's supposed to know the Word of God, and not in this democratic mob sense, but we all need to be able to know the Word of God and say what it says or doesn't say. So catechize everybody all the time. Memorize the catechism. That's not what this section is about. But pay attention to actually catechizing them in Lutheran theology, because then, if everybody's used to that, and that's what they get when they come in, you get people who are a part of your culture within a year, even though they're not actually Lutheran, because they know that you're standing on those things. We don't doubt certain people's cultural affiliations. If we know, if I came in here with hair I can't grow going down the side of my face and a big hat, everybody would say, he's actually Jewish, right? Or no? People should walk into your school and say it's actually Lutheran, even if they don't know what the word means yet. If they were given the vocabulary and the definition, they should be able to pull that together and say what it is. Sine qua non. Lastly, and this is, I guess, thanks to Russell Kirk and his idea of the conservative, the veneration and attention to the past should be a sine qua non. Now, attention is certainly important because you should be able to know what they did at your school or what they didn't do at your school, and maybe figure out why before you make a cultural decision or what you think is not a cultural decision. Well, who cares if I do this, right? And then somebody stops talking to you for a month. So just attention, right? Not veneration in the, we worship our past teachers and principles, but veneration and paying attention to the fact that I'm a part of a long game. I mean, Jesus could show up before I'm done talking. Maybe you'd all be really happy. I mean, you should be really happy. I'd be really happy. I wish it would have happened an hour ago, but that doesn't mean that we don't work and care and pay attention, even if we teach all of our students to know that they should be praying that Jesus comes both before and after they take their test, or before and after something fun occurs. All of that should be something that your school has. I think I've almost given you no time to ask me questions. So, thanks. I guess I could take one or two. You really should save them for Julia, though, because that will be a great place to complain about me. Or not. Yeah?
I thought you said there were 4, sine qua non, actual worship, catechize all the time, veneration and attention to the past, but I missed one.
Yeah, it's just 3. Show you the source. It's right here. Thank you for being diligent. So that's why she cares about handbooks.
You mentioned a few of them already, but were there any other positive things that you felt affected your culture as a school that you guys do or did that comes to mind at all?
Talk about food. The International Food Festival is not something every school can pull off because you might not have, first-generation immigrants who light incense in your gym to serve Ethiopian food. So, and then you have to tell them to stop because you can't, people are getting migraines. So, I think targeting things like everybody loves to eat, gathering around food is a great thing, we live in Houston, we have lots of people from different places, let's have an event that celebrates the actual meaning of the word diversity as opposed to the D-I-E culture. Right? Everybody should change those letters ordering. D-I-E. Something like that I would regard as a success. And people are fed. We had a lot, right? 200 people and 20 tables in 14 countries. But you can't do that everywhere. Right? So if anybody doesn't like that I was moderately esoteric, only that row lives with me. The rest of you live in different places, and you have cultures that can or cannot represent what I'm talking about, either because it's impossible or because it's unnecessary. There are certain things, though, that need to be there, and from which you can, as a group, figure out how to keep them the right way, or how to figure out that, man, I really messed up that this year. I need to change it next year. True. So you can blame, all my faculty can blame me for this, or not, right? I do make sure that everybody can deal with me before they get into the school. Because usually, right, everybody's nicer than me and kinder. So if they can put up with me, then the teachers are a piece of cake. So I'm sort of the litmus test. And I make sure I see everybody. If the administrator doesn't try to meet everyone, I could make that the fourth sine qua non. You should know who's in your house. And I just don't mean checking in and, but you should know who's there. Because you pay attention to them and make sure they get the right thing. So I think having a way in which you can meet everybody and talk to everyone also helps with you being regarded as the person who keeps the culture. Anybody else? Great. Thank you very much.